Right, so Keir Starmer, he's appeared on Jeremy Vine's show where he has sat there and he's talked about refusing to back a ceasefire in Gaza and what his reasoning was behind that. The logic, as he saw it, the method to his madness, as it were. The only trouble is, he's just gone to prove how absolutely deranged his logic actually was, how much he is taking us all for fools now, and basically presented a statement justifying how he was right to back what rapidly became obvious to everyone else as being a genocide, where war crimes were quickly being identified as being committed, and how he sees himself as having been on the right side of history then by backing Israel's actions before, but is on the right side of history again now because all of a sudden he wants us to believe things have changed, and him doing a complete 180 is completely understandable and logical. Well, actually, the only thing that has changed is the scale of the destruction and the death toll of innocent Gazan civilians that could have been absolutely avoidable if he had actually done the right thing and actually been on the right side of history and put people's lives first and not his apparent loyalties to the Israeli state.
We had the worst terrorist attack since the Second World War in relation to what happened on October the 7th, terrible terrorist attack by Hamas. And Israel has the right to self-defense. And in the very early days, people were saying there should be an immediate ceasefire. And I said that would only benefit Hamas. We're now months down the line. Thousands of people have been killed in Gaza. There's a threatened defensive in Rafah, where there's a humanitarian catastrophe. And now is the time for a ceasefire.
Not earlier.
Because the circumstances...
It would have saved a lot of lives if you'd done it earlier.
The circumstances have changed dramatically. And Jeremy, to say to Israel immediately after October the 7th, you cannot go and get your hostages back for using force. That wasn't something which a serious politician was ever going to say. But we're in a different...
supporters wanted you to say that.
We're in a different position now. Thousands of people have been killed. There's a desperate situation in Rafah. 1 million and more people who can't go forwards and can't go backwards. And that's why very many people are saying now is the time to stop the fighting, to create the conditions to get the hostages out, get much needed aid in, and for a political process that gets us to a peaceful solution, a two-state solution.
But I gave you...
Right, so that was Keir Starmer on the Jeremy Vine show yesterday morning. And of course, we've heard him speak on the Israel-Gaza situation before. And I've made many videos now holding his feet to the fire over that. Our next, in all likelihood, Prime Minister, for the abhorrent position he has taken on this situation, on this matter, on this genocide, and the position he's maintained since October 7th. And of course, he started his spiel there in exactly that same way again here. His go-to starting point, as ever, is the terrorist attack, as he put it, by Hamas on Israel. And of course the implication there being that all of the fatalities seen on that night were the responsibility of Hamas, despite more and more evidence pointing to a lot of the fatalities being the responsibility of Israeli forces instead. And of course the allegations that Israel knew this attack was coming. Egypt continued to claim Israel was warned by them in advance, and there were also allegations that the US had done similarly. Hamas certainly didn't go into the Nova Music Festival with helicopter gunships and tanks in the nearby kibbutzes because they don't have these things. But Israel certainly did, and we've got the footage and seen the aftermath of those actions. Many of the bodies were so badly burned that Israel took custody of. It took Israel 6 weeks to realise they'd miscounted and had accidentally taken some 200 Hamas bodies that they thought were Israeli. A gaffe dropped by Israeli spokesperson Mark Regev, which revealed that Israel clearly had to have been the ones doing the burning, because Hamas wouldn't have burned their own people. Their aim was to take hostages to exchange for their own, which never got talked about in the mainstream media. Israel, of course, holding a great many more hostages in their prisons than Hamas are holding in Gaza. These things have been known about for some time now, so it's shameless that politicians are still pointing at Hamas for being the only ones at fault on that night, and the media to this day still do not challenge it. But also both politicians and media omit to acknowledge that whilst they talk of a terrorist attack on Israel, that under international law, as an occupied people, as the people of Gaza are, they have the right to resist that occupation. It has been decades of failure on the international stage that Israel still occupies the Palestinian territories. They have no business doing so and should have been held to account long before now for it. These events today and since October 7th would never have happened if this had been dealt with when it should have been dealt with. But even now, there's no appetite for something as dramatic as freeing Palestine, when we can't even get a damn ceasefire through, and gaslighting clowns like Starmer talking of Israel's right to self-defense, how it was the worst casualty rate since World War II, ignoring the fact Israel may in no small part be responsible for much of that. They are part of the reason for that, supporting the Tories on this matter, Starmer's Labour, who of course are just following Genocide Joe's lead. But then, the real idiocy began, didn't it? People, early days, asking for a ceasefire. Well, God forbid they asked for a ceasefire. Something that would stop more people dying unnecessarily. Well, we can't have that. That doesn't make sense. Where's the logic in that? Well, with Israel having the right to defend itself from people whose land they illegally occupy at that. We all remember what you said, Keir Starmer, early days, even though you deny it.
I'm very clear. Israel must have that, does have that right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the sort of core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself and Hamas bears responsibility for these terrorist acts. And I would call on all responsible states, particularly Middle East responsible states, to call this out for what it is, and to stand with the world in condemning, utterly condemning, these actions by Hamas.
Never forgive, never forget. Keir Starmer advocated for Israel to be allowed to commit war crimes, and he's never apologised for it. I doubt he ever will. He doesn't say sorry, and refuses to acknowledge he even said it, but it's on film, as you've just seen, and it deserves to haunt him for the rest of his days. But let's come back to the here and now and the Jeremy Vine interview. When Parliament voted back in November on a ceasefire amendment, an amendment laid down by the SNP for an immediate ceasefire, when Starmer whipped his MPs to abstain, he ended up losing 10 front benchers over that because they refused to be complicit in such abject cowardice. 56 of his MPs, all told, rebelled against Starmer's sickening stance. 11,000 people, innocent people in Gaza, had already been killed by that point, and here he is saying we couldn't avoid that because it would only benefit Hamas. No, it would have benefited the lives of every single one of those people who had died, and indeed would have saved the lives of the 20,000 people who have now died since. How the hell he can sit there and ignore that death toll because Hamas is insane. It's literally insane. How dare he take all of us for such fools? Hamas took hostages, kept them alive. It was in their interest to keep them alive. We're well looked after. We have testimonies from those already freed that attest to their treatment. Much better than the treatment Israeli captives get, being starved, stripped, tortured and beaten, as we have more testimonies to attest to on that score. You don't take hostages to later kill them. That makes no sense. We've all seen enough police dramas, I'm sure, where hostages are taken. We've all seen Die Hard or some other such movie where hostages are taken, so we know why hostages get taken. They get taken as bargaining chips. In this case, Hamas wanted their people freed in exchange. It's why they've taken hostages previously. This is established. We know why they've done it before. We know this is why they do it. It is precisely why Israel has such a thing as Hannibal directives, to kill their own people rather than let them be taken captive. Because the last thing Israel wants is free Palestinians to enable them to just go home. Especially when, as it becomes more and more obvious and more of Netanyahu's government are brazen enough to speak out on it, they want that land for Israel and Israeli settlers. But it also shows a worrying disregard for life. But now Starmer is saying, well, the circumstances have changed, and it's time now to shift towards a ceasefire. Though as that recent hijacking of an SNP Opposition Day vote showed just last month, his version of a ceasefire again is not immediate. It is indeterminate when and for how long in Labour's case, because that's what their amendment put forward. It gives them a soundbite. It means they can stand up and say we backed a ceasefire. But what they actually backed was vague. The Starmer knows the cost because the ignorant fool was told what the ramifications of not acting earlier would be, and he rolled them off as if he hadn't been complicit in that interview. Thousands of people have now died, and you were warned. A threatened offensive in Rafah by Israel, entirely by Israel, aided and abetted by those arming them, which you have supported. Again, you were warned. From north to south, Israel had been razing Gaza to the ground. There's a humanitarian catastrophe there too. Glad you noticed. It's something else you were also warned about. Jeremy Vine challenged him over those things, saying if they'd acted earlier, these things could have been avoided. But Starmer, oh, no, but the circumstances have now changed. No, they haven't. Just the political climate. And you, ever the populist, are now shifting with it, blowing in the wind as he always does. Things haven't changed dramatically. The only thing that has changed is the scale of the devastation, which was avoidable if you'd had some balls and stood up for what was right before, instead of what was politically expedient and what your pro-Israel lobbyists must have demanded, I presume. I dare say even they are now acknowledging there needs to be a shift, as goodwill towards Israel, as they live to promote, becomes a much harder sell. And that is actually the circumstance that has now changed. But that's not what Starmer claims, of course. We could tell Israel they couldn't go and get their hostages back. Well, here's a thought. Yes, you could. If you weren't bought and paid for by the Israel lobby, you'd have been in a position to say negotiate. You'd be in a position to say to Israel, hang on a minute, you hold thousands of Palestinian hostages in your prisons that you've no business holding anymore, that are being held without charge. Many more than Hamas have been holding of your people, so exchange them. That is exactly what a serious politician would have done. Negotiate, got around a table, got these things hammered out, instead of letting people die in their tens of thousands. Not a clown like you. Pretending this entire affair is all on Hamas is drivel, because it's sick, because it goes back so much further than October 7th, and we all know that now. We're all more aware now. Israel is the occupying power. They have committed far greater atrocity in Gaza over the last 5 months than anything Hamas did for their part on the one night of October 7th, the one night of October 7th, but not if you listen to politicians like Starmer. Many people are now not suddenly talking about a ceasefire. It has been going since the beginning, because ultimately all the death and destruction solves nothing. Hostages in Gaza have been killed, but as a result of Israeli bombardment. Therefore, we're also completely avoidable, something a serious politician would point out. No resolution comes until weapons are laid down, and you've just given Israel the nod to do what they've done for all this time, choosing now to say, well, things have changed. They finished the damn job of razing Gaza to the ground, and you helped enable it by not speaking out against it earlier. And now what remnants are left of the Gazan people are all holed up, some 1.1 million of them in Rafah, with Netanyahu threatening to go in with a military strike. And now you speak up. Now you're starting to get worried. My contempt for Keir Starmer only grows with every passing day, and this interview, I dare say, will have rightfully revolted many. And at the end of the day, so much of what Starmer is saying here is all talk, when within the party suspensions continue of people saying they back a ceasefire, even after this most recent vote for a ceasefire that Starmer's Labour hijacked, again implying there's no intent behind the words that they're saying even now, as this video recommendation will tell you all about. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.